The town of Flaxborough was, by any reasonable measure, a town accustomed to its own ordinariness. Its streets curved in a slightly lazy arc, lined with brick and stone houses whose residents knew precisely which day the dustman passed, which grocer carried the best marrow-fat peas, and which florist would have the stiffest chrysanthemums. It was the kind of place where excitement rarely intruded, and if it did, it announced itself with the polite fanfare of gossip rather than urgency. On a warm June afternoon, the Flaxborough Flower Show convened in the town hall, an event anticipated more for the social ritual than horticultural excellence. Mrs. Trilby of Hesketh Avenue had won Best Begonia 3 years running, and a rumour had it that she cross-pollinated in secret. Mr. Hargreaves, who ran the railway buffet, had donated a tray of his now famous scones, each individually wrapped in a waxed paper triangle. Children skipped along the aisles, and ladies whispered about the new vicar's rather untimely moustache. It was, in short, a day exactly as the town expected, until the clock struck 3. A sound, a muffled but unmistakable cry, rippled through the hall. The first to notice was Miss Lillian Petty, custodian of the town library and unspoken authority on social etiquette, who clutched her embroidery like a shield. "Good heavens," she whispered. A second later, Mr. Hargreaves emerged from behind his scone stand, wiping a smudge of flour from his lapel. "Is that someone in distress?" he asked, his voice carrying more curiosity than alarm. At the far end of the hall, behind a particularly grand display of dahlias, a small cluster had gathered. There, seated on the floor, and looking faintly aghast, was Mrs. Agnes Wilcox, the widow who lived at the corner of Lavender Road. She was clutching her handbag to her chest, as though it might protect her from some invisible calamity. It's terrible!" she exclaimed, her voice quivering with the precise pitch reserved for polite hysteria. "It's gone! My pearl brooch! Stolen!" A hush descended. Pearls, after all, were serious business in Flaxborough. They had weight, they had history, and in Mrs. Wilcox's case, they had an evident sentimental attachment to her late husband's memory. The hall's attention sharpened. The flower show suddenly seemed a venue for something far more dramatic than dahlias and scones. Mr. Hargreaves frowned, adjusting his bow tie. "Stolen, you say?" "Yes," Mrs. Wilcox replied, her eyes round and glistening. "It was here, right here, on my table, and now gone." The hall erupted in whispers. Opinions, speculation, and small indignations spread with a velocity no one would have thought possible in Flaxborough. Miss Petty's lips moved rapidly, though no sound emerged, and Mr. Hargreaves muttered under his breath, "No good can come of this." From his usual vantage point near the exit, Inspector Purbright observed the proceedings with a calm patience that contrasted sharply with the mild hysteria. He had arrived not long after the initial cry, ostensibly to enjoy the display of flowers, but his professional instincts were quietly alert. There was nothing violent, nothing immediately threatening, just an upset lady, a missing brooch, and a crowd that had yet to decide whether it was scandal or simple misfortune. Purbright's eyes swept the hall with discreet precision. The exhibitors' smiles were slightly too tight, the children's laughter a shade too high-pitched, the whispers a careful balance of concern and intrigue. He made no move to approach Mrs. Wilcox yet. One did not rush in such matters. It was better, always, to allow the minor chaos to reveal its own hidden structure. Even in a town as measured as Flaxborough, one could sense the invisible lines being drawn. Who sympathized with Mrs. Wilcox, who envied her pearls, who might have passed too close to her table just a few minutes ago. And somewhere among them, perhaps innocently, perhaps not, was the person responsible for the sudden rupture in Flaxborough's otherwise placid rhythm. Purbright sipped a cup of mild tea provided by a reluctant town hall volunteer. "Very curious," he murmured to himself, though nobody heard. Curiosity, after all, was the polite beginning of every inquiry, and in Flaxborough the polite beginning was often the most revealing, and so the flower show, meant to showcase order, taste, and gentle competition, had quietly become a puzzle, small in scale, yet laden with the unspoken anxieties and subtle rivalries of an entire town. By the following morning, the echoes of Mrs. Wilcox's cry at the flower show had settled into the town's usual rhythm, though not without leaving their mark. Flaxborough never admitted to excitement easily. It preferred to disguise curiosity beneath a veneer of civility and routine. Yet the missing pearl brooch had become a quiet point of conversation, whispered at morning teas, murmured over grocers' counters, and repeated with subtle exaggeration by children who had overheard more than they understood. At the town hall, Mrs. Wilcox herself arrived with a resolute air, her hand tightly clutching the edges of her coat as if it could shield her from both the chill of the morning and the indignity of repeated inquiry. She was immediately approached by Mrs. Trilby, who had won Best Begonia yet again, and appeared to consider herself the unofficial moral arbiter of all things social. "Oh, Agnes, I do hope you've spoken to the police," Mrs. Trilby said, her voice clipped but sympathetic. "One simply cannot allow such things to pass without attention. Imagine if it were one of us. One must protect one's property at all times." Mrs. Wilcox's lips trembled slightly. Yes, I've spoken to Inspector Purbright. He assures me he will make inquiries. But, my dear, do you think—" She paused, lowering her voice to a tremulous whisper. "Do you think anyone in this town could—" Mrs. Trilby's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "One hopes not. Though sadly, envy is the most common visitor at such gatherings. We all know how some folk cannot abide another's success, however small." Meanwhile, the morning paper, a narrow column of black type on crumpled white sheets, carried the incident in a modest paragraph tucked between reports of the council's new lamppost painting schedule and a forthcoming lecture on local beekeeping. "Local widow reports theft of jewellery at annual flower show," it read. The phrasing was polite, almost conspiratorial in its restraint, as though to suggest that one might speculate, but not too loudly. In Flaxborough, speculation was never subtle. At Hargreaves' railway buffet, the scone supplier of the flower show, chatter over teacups was brisk. Mr. Hargreaves himself, a man who preferred the predictable hum of railway schedules to the unpredictable vibrations of human intrigue, found himself drawn into the discussion despite a persistent headache and a mild suspicion that the excitement was entirely unnecessary. "Did you hear about Wilcox's pearls?" he asked a new assistant who had recently arrived from a slightly larger town and was still learning the careful etiquette of small-town suspicion. "Yes, sir," the assistant replied, trying to appear both informed and discreet. "Terrible business. People are saying—" The voice dropped to a whisper, though in Hargreaves' experience, whispers rarely travelled slower than shouts in Flaxborough. "Some say it could have been that young Miss Aldridge. She was spotted quite near Mrs. Wilcox's table, wasn't she?" Hargreaves paused, spoon suspended above a cup of tea, and considered the remark. He knew better than to comment. Gossip in Flaxborough was a social currency and could bind or sever alliances with equal efficiency. Nevertheless, he could not. entirely resist the temptation to note the curious detail that Miss Aldridge had indeed lingered near Mrs. Wilcox's exhibit longer than most. Across town, the post office functioned as a quieter hub of rumour. The clerks, efficient in their delivery of letters but voracious in their accumulation of idle knowledge, had already compiled a speculative list of likely culprits. They included, in descending order of probability according to their own ranking, Mr. Langford, the retired banker, who had been seen scrutinizing the jewellery display with a gaze that suggested faint envy, Mrs. Trilby, whose relentless pursuit of best begonia prizes could be interpreted, if one stretched credulity, as a motive, and even the vicar, whose new moustache had caused a stir among those who considered social appearances a moral compass. It was a curious phenomenon of Flaxborough life that such speculation often acquired a rhythm of its own. People would speak, quietly at first, then repeat what they heard in slightly altered form, and by the time the news reached the corner grocer or the hairdresser, it had acquired the subtle trappings of certainty. And yet, amidst all this careful conjecture, Inspector Purbright moved like a shadow at the edges of the narrative. He had begun his inquiries the previous afternoon with a series of polite interviews. Mrs. Wilcox, of course, had been the first, her distress genuine, though tempered with an instinctive awareness of social propriety. She had described the scene with meticulous attention to the arrangement of her pearls, the placement of the velvet-lined box, and the exact moment she had turned to adjust a floral display. Yet her testimony, while precise, had contained small contradictions, a hesitation here, a slight exaggeration there, which Purbright noted quietly without comment. Next, he had spoken to Mr. Hargreaves, whose knowledge of the crowd's movements was surprisingly detailed. Hargreaves recalled the precise order in which visitors had approached the tables, the way a lady in a blue hat had lingered too long near Mrs. Wilcox's stand, and the brief, suspicious glance of a man he could not name. Purbright had listened, nodding politely, storing each observation like a bead on an invisible thread, allowing the narrative to form its own shape before acting upon it. The third interview had been with Miss Petty, whose reputation for decorum was rivaled only by her capacity for keen observation. She had noted, in her delicate way, the almost imperceptible tension between Mrs. Wilcox and several neighbouring exhibitors. There was, she suggested, a faint but consistent rivalry between Mrs. Wilcox and Mrs. Trilby, manifesting in subtle gestures, a folded hand, a raised eyebrow, a slightly too long pause before congratulatory words were offered. By mid-morning, the initial cluster of suspects and observations had begun to form an unofficial map of intrigue. Purbright was careful not to make this map public. Flaxborough thrived on ambiguity, and premature certainty was almost invariably a social misstep. Instead, he wandered the streets with a calm deliberation, observing who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, and who seemed to linger over minor injustices that might otherwise have been ignored. Even the children, those seemingly inconsequential witnesses, had not escaped his attention. They possessed the curious advantage of seeing patterns without the distortion of social politeness. A group of them, sitting on the low stone wall outside the town hall, had been trading guesses. I saw her hand twitch when Mrs. Wilcox turned. "Around," said one, who appeared to have memorized every minute detail of the previous day. "I think she's hiding something," said another, nodding solemnly. Purbright smiled faintly to himself. Children, though prone to exaggeration, often are observed more accurately than adults. He filed their comments away, not as statements of fact, but as indicators of human behavior and unconscious gestures. Meanwhile, the gossip machine accelerated. At the hairdresser's, Mrs. Whitcomb offered a critique of Miss Aldridge's new gloves, suggesting that her interest in Mrs. Wilcox's table had been opportunistic. At the grocer's, Mr. Cartwright mused over the likelihood of a professional thief operating in a town that had scarcely seen a real crime in a decade. Each opinion, trivial in isolation, created a lattice of suspicion that Purbright could trace if he wished. And he did, though always discreetly, always with patience. By late afternoon, he returned to the town hall to observe Mrs. Wilcox once more. The widow had come to accept her position as a reluctant public figure, attracting polite inquiries and discreet offers of sympathy. She demonstrated the pearl's absence with a careful gesture, her voice measured, her posture dignified. Purbright approached quietly, noting the slight flicker in her expression when he merely nodded in acknowledgement. "It is curious," he remarked without embellishment, "how a single missing object can so neatly disrupt the town's rhythm." Mrs. Wilcox gave a faint, appreciative smile. "I do not know whether to be grateful for your interest, Inspector, or to wish I had kept the brooch hidden forever." Purbright inclined his head, considering. The remark was neither complaint nor confession, but the subtle balance of irony and truth inherent in Flaxborough's social dialogue. He left her to her contemplations, stepping back into the quiet corridors of observation that the town afforded him. Evenings in Flaxborough were gentle. The lamps flickered in the windows, and the air carried the faint smell of coal smoke and damp roses. Yet behind the calm exterior, the web of speculation continued to grow. Each resident had formed an opinion, each conversation added a thread, and somewhere in this lattice the truth lay concealed, not in the loud declarations of suspicion, but in the unnoticed glances, the tiny hesitations, and the polite, patient gestures of human behavior. Purbright made his way back to the station, his mind deliberately unhurried. He considered the town, its routines, its hidden frictions, and the way that small grievances could grow into perceived crises. A missing brooch was a trivial matter in some places, yet here it had become a lens through which the town examined itself. In the quiet of his office, he poured a cup of tea and allowed the events of the day to settle. Tomorrow, he reflected, would bring new opportunities for observation, and perhaps, with careful patience, a hint of the truth. Flaxborough slept that night, unaware that the delicate equilibrium of its social order had already shifted. A single cry at a flower show had been sufficient to awaken the curiosity of the entire town, and somewhere, among the polite conjectures and restrained indignations, the real cause of disturbance waited patiently, hidden in plain sight, for the right moment to reveal itself. By the morning following the flower show, Inspector Purbright had resolved that the most effective approach was to move with deliberate patience, observing before questioning, listening before drawing any conclusion. Flaxborough's rhythm was subtle and intricate, and only by attending to its nuances could one hope to discern truth from polite fiction. His first visit was to Mrs. Wilcox herself, whose composure had improved marginally overnight, but who remained, carefully attentive to every detail in her drawing-room. She offered him tea in her best china, the kind that demanded careful handling, and arranged a plate of biscuits in a neat semicircle on the silver tray. "I am grateful for your interest." "Inspector," she began, her voice poised, though a slight tremor betrayed lingering anxiety. "It is a singularly distressing experience, one I would not wish on anyone, though I suppose that is easily said by those who have never been at the mercy of such audacity." Purbright inclined his head politely, taking a seat opposite her without reaching for the tea. "The audacity is often less relevant than the circumstances," he observed softly. "May I ask you again to describe precisely where the brooch was placed and who was nearby when you noticed it missing?" Mrs. Wilcox adjusted a cushion beneath her hands. "It was upon the velvet lining of my box, which I had arranged beside the dahlias." I left the hall momentarily to inspect a neighbour's display, only for a few minutes, perhaps 3, and returned to find the box open and the brooch absent. Several people had passed near the table in my brief absence, but I cannot identify any with certainty. She sighed lightly, a delicate mixture of distress and dignity. I noted Miss Aldridge lingering, too near, I thought, and a gentleman in spectacles whose gaze lingered a little too long upon my jewellery. But I cannot claim to know their intentions, Inspector. Purbright made a mental note of these details. He did not comment. Noting contradictions, hesitations, or excessive emphasis was sufficient at this stage. The act of speaking often revealed as much as the content itself. From there, he visited Mr. Hargreaves at the railway buffet. The man had reopened his small shop, still recovering from the mild scandal of the preceding day. He offered a cup of tea that was more habit than warmth, and spoke readily of what he had observed. "I watched the hall closely," Hargreaves said, his voice careful, as if navigating invisible social minds. "The young ladies in attendance were far more interested in the dahlias than in the jewellery, generally speaking, but I did notice a small cluster near the end table, Mrs. Wilcox's. It was subtle, nothing overt, but—" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You can tell a glance that lingers too long, can't you, Inspector? It is a language the ladies never speak aloud." Purbright nodded once, appreciating the understated precision of Hargreaves' observation. The railway man's attentiveness was not merely incidental, it was habitual. He filed away the detail of the lingering glance, noting also Hargreaves' reluctance to name names, a subtle measure of both discretion and fear of social fallout. Later, Purbright called on Miss Lillian Petty at the library. The custodian of books and social propriety had already amassed an impressive catalogue of the town's whispered conjectures. She welcomed him with a calm courtesy that masked her eagerness to discuss the incident in full. "I observed several subtle tensions yesterday," she began, folding her hands neatly. "Mrs. Wilcox and Mrs. Trilby exchanged more than a few non-verbal cues. The former maintained a polite expression, yet there were micro-expressions, tightened lips, fleeting frowns that betrayed irritation. Miss Aldridge, as you have heard, was near the table longer than politeness would dictate. And the vicar, well, he lingered just beyond sight, observing rather intently." Purbright sipped his tea slowly, weighing the evidence in the subtle texture of their speech and behaviour. "It is remarkable," he remarked, "how minor irritations and minute gestures can generate a more accurate depiction of human intentions than overt accusation." Petty inclined her head. "Indeed, Inspector, in Flaxborough it is the understated interactions, the glance, the pause, the carefully measured words that reveal the landscape of motives." The afternoon found Purbright visiting Miss Aldridge, who received him in the sunny parlour of her modest home. The young woman, intelligent and articulate, expressed polite curiosity more than concern. "I hear you've been making enquiries," she said, settling a teacup with perfect composure. "Of course, I was near Mrs. Wilcox's table, but I assure you my interest lay purely in the arrangement of her dahlias. One admires technique, you see, not always the ornamentation." "Certainly," Purbright said, noting a slight hesitancy in her voice when she mentioned the brooch. "And yet you were observed lingering longer than others. Did anyone else attract your attention?" Miss Aldridge's eyes brightened slightly. "Only in the sense that the vicar appeared curiously fascinated by everything. I wondered whether he had brought flowers for someone, or if he merely enjoyed the spectacle of community. I assure you, Inspector, I took no more than a polite glance at Mrs. Wilcox's belongings." The subtle mixture of defensiveness and propriety was exactly the sort of behaviour Purbright catalogued silently. He left her home without a single accusation, having collected observations rather than judgments. By evening he had walked the town's quiet streets, reflecting upon the collected accounts. Each witness had provided fragments of a broader picture: Mrs. Wilcox's emotional distress, Hargreaves' attentive observations, Petty's social analysis, Aldridge's polite explanations. None spoke falsely, perhaps, but none provided the complete truth either. Purbright paused by the riverside, noting the slow current and the occasional splash of a startled fish. Crime, he reflected, was not merely a matter of law or morality. It was a matter of human habits, desires, and social pressures. The missing brooch had done more than unsettle a widow. It had revealed fissures in the town's ostensibly placid structure, the petty rivalries, the concealed resentments, and the private ambitions that had existed unnoticed until the incident drew attention. Later, at the police station, he reviewed his notes. Observations were organized not chronologically but thematically: gestures, hesitations, social hierarchies, and the subtle patterns of human behavior that so often concealed intention. He considered the evidence carefully, noting particularly the micro-expressions and delayed responses recorded by his interviews. A trivial detail had already begun to nag at him. During his conversation with Hargreaves, a fleeting remark, seemingly incidental, hinted at the placement of Mrs. Wilcox's box relative to the dahlia display. A small gap between the arrangements might have provided someone with a convenient opportunity, a few seconds' access unnoticed. The thought was neither dramatic nor alarming, yet it offered a thread that could unravel a larger tapestry. Meanwhile, the town itself continued to hum with quiet speculation. In the grocer's, Mrs. Cartwright noted that the widow's loss might be tied to envy. At the hairdresser's, Miss Whitcomb suggested a practical joke gone too far. The vicar continued his daily rounds with serene detachment, unaware, or pretending to be, of the waves of gossip his presence had stirred. Flaxborough's citizens, in their cautious curiosity, were simultaneously observers, participants, and inadvertent conspirators in the slow unfolding of the story. Purbright, alone with his thoughts, considered the delicate balance of propriety and curiosity that defined the town. The missing brooch was more than a trivial theft. It was a lens through which human behavior could be read. He reflected upon micro-tensions, the polite deceptions, and the unspoken motivations that had quietly surfaced. His next steps, he realized, would require a careful mixture of observation, subtle interrogation, and the patience that had always served him well. By the time dusk fell, Flaxborough's streets were bathed in golden light, and the town settled into its customary evening. Quiet. Yet, for those who listened closely, a tension remained in the air, the soft hum of expectation that preceded revelation. The widow, the young women, the vicar, and even the seemingly indifferent tradesman were bound together in a web of minor curiosities, small grievances, and social vigilance. Inspector Purbright sipped his tea in the solitude of his office, methodically reviewing every remark, every gesture, and every pause. Tomorrow, he knew, would require more careful inquiry. Each person had spoken, yet none had spoken the whole truth. And in Flaxborough, as in all towns where human behavior dictated the pace of discovery, truth often hid behind ordinary routines, polite gestures, and the subtle interplay of attention and indifference. By midweek, the missing brooch had become, in the polite parlance of Flaxborough, a matter of some curiosity, though the intensity of that curiosity varied considerably according to one's social position and proximity to Mrs. Wilcox. In the police station, the constables had already begun to lean toward what they regarded as a tidy solution. The notion, quietly discussed over ledger entries and the clatter of typewriters, was that a single suspect could be identified and the matter closed with minimal fuss. The primary candidate, according to the gossip-imbued logic of the local constabulary, was Miss Aldridge. She had been observed loitering near the widow's table for longer than politeness dictated, and her presence at the flower show was conspicuously noticeable among the young women of Flaxborough. Inspector Purbright, however, withheld any judgment. He understood all too well that certainty often arrived only after a careful, measured examination of circumstances that were invisible to casual observers. Purbright began his day with a quiet visit to Miss Aldridge's home. The young woman received him with the same calm composure she had displayed during their first encounter, though there was now a trace of unease in her posture. "I gather there is still interest in the brooch," she said, her voice even, but her fingers twisting the edge of a handkerchief. "Curiosity," Purbright corrected gently, "which in this town rarely remains idle." Miss Aldridge offered a faint, polite smile, but her eyes betrayed the slightest tension. "I understand the observations. I had hoped, of course, that my intentions were clear." "Indeed," he said, speaking with measured patience. "And yet appearances, as you doubtless appreciate, can be misleading. One's position relative to an object of interest, the timing of one's movements, and even minor gestures, can be interpreted in various ways." She inclined her head, acknowledging the point without comment. Purbright made no accusations, merely observed her reactions, noting the careful balance between composure and apprehension. The young woman's responses were consistent, yet there were the faintest ripples of hesitation that only a trained eye could detect. He filed them away, adding a subtle dimension to the portrait of behavior he was assembling. Later that morning, he walked along Lavender Road, past the widow's house, and contemplated the small, orderly gardens and neatly painted fences. The town itself seemed to reflect the social precision of its inhabitants, each hedgerow trimmed, each front step swept, each window washed with meticulous care. Yet behind the surface of order, Purbright recognized the faint distortions that curiosity, envy, and resentment often created. At the town hall, he met with the constables, who were eager to proceed with their own tentative theory. They spoke of Miss Aldridge's lingering at the table, the suspicious glance recorded by Hargreaves, and the predictable rivalry between Mrs. Wilcox and other exhibitors. Purbright listened, offering polite acknowledgment, but no affirmation. He had learned over the years that premature certainty was as dangerous as neglect. Afterward, he visited Mrs. Trilby at her home. The perpetual winner of the Best Begonia Prize regarded him through half-moon spectacles with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "It is a terrible business," she said, her voice firm with the weight of authority, "and I trust you are handling it with the necessary diligence. One cannot allow the young to believe that any indiscretion may pass unnoticed. They must understand that civility and propriety are paramount." Purbright made a careful note of her emphasis on civility and propriety. In Flaxborough, such insistence often concealed as much as it revealed. He asked neutral questions about the arrangement of tables, the flow of visitors, and the placement of Mrs. Wilcox's belongings, allowing her to provide answers rich in both detail and potential bias. As the day wore on, Purbright made his rounds to other members of the town. Mr. Hargreaves provided additional notes regarding the order in which visitors approached the displays with small but telling observations on who appeared distracted or unusually attentive. Miss Petty contributed her own reflections, noting the subtleties of social behavior, a raised eyebrow here, a fleeting glance there, and the slight tensing of shoulders in polite confrontation. By late afternoon, the first obvious suspect, Miss Aldridge, had become a convenient focal point for many. In the hairdressers, in the grocers, and at the railway buffet, her name was repeated with a polite but firm certainty. Flaxborough's citizens, satisfied that a culprit had emerged, began to relax. Even the vicar, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued his rounds in serene detachment. Purbright, however, was not satisfied. He recognized that the alignment of suspicion around a single individual could be both misleading and convenient. There was no overt evidence, only inference, and interpretation and human behavior rarely conformed to tidy conclusions. He spent the evening reviewing his notes, considering the nuances he had observed, minor hesitations, gestures, and contradictions that seemed inconsequential but might prove significant. The small but odd detail that had begun to occupy his thoughts was the precise placement of Mrs. Wilcox's jewellery box in relation to the dahlia display. A narrow gap had existed, sufficient for a brief, unnoticed reach. This, combined with the series of micro-expressions and social gestures he had recorded, suggested the possibility of opportunity but not guilt. He was reminded that in Flaxborough appearances could be deceiving, and the polite consensus of the town often concealed more than it revealed. In the quiet of his office, Purbright reflected on human behavior. People rarely acted with clear malice. Rather, their motives were tangled in envy, curiosity, and a desire for recognition. He considered the constable's eagerness to identify a culprit and the town's readiness to accept a tidy explanation. Each element reinforced the necessity of restraint, careful observation, and subtle testing before conclusions could be drawn. Night fell over Flaxborough, bathing the streets in soft lamplight. The town seemed at peace, yet the inspector knew that beneath the calm surface patterns were emerging, threads that could be followed to reveal the truth. He allowed himself a modest dinner and reviewed the day's notes once more, arranging observations thematically, gestures, timing, social interactions, and the placement of key objects. Each detail, however minor, contributed to the evolving portrait of the day's events. By the time he extinguished the lamp and prepared for rest, Purbright had resolved his plan for the following day: to continue discreet observation, follow subtle inconsistencies, and most importantly, to allow human behavior itself to reveal the hidden motives that had turned a simple flower show into a matter of intense curiosity. The first obvious suspect had emerged, but he knew better than to let appearances dictate the outcome. In Flaxborough, truth was rarely obvious, and patience was the most reliable instrument in discerning it. The morning air carried a soft drizzle that left the cobblestones of Flaxborough glistening, the kind of weather that encouraged introspection and the careful observation of ordinary patterns. Inspector Purbright stepped onto the streets with his umbrella held at a precise angle, noting the occasional ripple of leaves in the wind and the orderly procession of shopkeepers opening for the day. The town, for all its polite appearance, seemed unusually alert. The missing brooch had left its quiet mark, and gossip, like a persistent mist, lingered in every doorway and window. Purbright's first stop was the town hall, not for conversation with the exhibitors, but to observe the arrangement of the displays once more. Though the flower show had ended 2 days prior, he wanted to trace the physical possibilities of opportunity. He examined the tables as carefully as a watchmaker might study a mechanism. The narrow gap between Mrs. Wilcox's dahlia arrangement and the adjoining table was slight, barely perceptible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Yet in that space, someone with sufficient intent and sufficient timing might reach past the flowers without attracting notice. It was a trivial detail, almost laughably so, and yet it nagged at him with the persistence of a faint but insistent alarm. He moved next to Mrs. Wilcox's home, ostensibly to confirm the precise contents of the missing jewellery box. The widow received him with polite gravity, serving tea as she discussed the chronology of the day. Purbright asked questions, careful and unassuming, regarding the moment she had left her table and the sequence of visitors. As she described, a gentleman in spectacles who had glanced curiously at the jewellery, he noted a slight discrepancy between her recollection and the account Hargreaves had given. The widow's memory, while largely reliable, contained the faintest fluctuation of emphasis, a pause where certainty should have prevailed, a small hesitation over the order of visitors. Such minor inconsistencies were rarely accidental, Purbright reflected. They suggested attention focused elsewhere or subtle gaps in observation, both of which could reveal as much as overt statements. He did not pursue the discrepancy aggressively. Instead, he allowed it to settle in his mind, forming one more filament in the intricate web of human behavior he was cataloguing. By mid-morning, he was strolling along Lavender Road once again, observing Mrs. Wilcox's neighbours as they tended their gardens. Each displayed the quiet civility expected in Flaxborough, yet beneath the surface there were faint social currents. A neighbour who lingered a few moments too long on her own porch as Mrs. Wilcox left for the market, a slight tightening of a handshake exchanged with a visiting friend. These were the trivial gestures that could, if interpreted correctly, reveal hidden intentions. Purbright's attention was drawn, however, to an almost absurdly minor anomaly. A letter had been delivered to Mrs. Wilcox the previous afternoon, left carelessly on the sideboard. The handwriting was unmistakably her niece's, a cheerful, sprawling script, usually accompanied by a delicate scent of violet perfume. Today, though, there was a small smudge on the paper, a barely noticeable smear on the envelope flap, as if it had been handled hurriedly or with some degree of nervousness. He could not say why, but the triviality of the smudge captured his attention more than the larger, more dramatic possibilities of theft. In Flaxborough, he had learned that such minutiae often revealed the movement of intention and anxiety with greater fidelity than any loud declaration. His next visit was to Mr. Hargreaves, who was arranging freshly baked scones behind the glass counter of the railway buffet. The man's manner was brisk, efficient, yet there was a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes when Purbright mentioned the flower show. Hargreaves, as ever, was careful with words, but in the slight hesitation, the inspector noted the unconscious disclosure of attention that had been divided or distracted. "I've been thinking," Hargreaves said finally, breaking the polite silence that had settled over the counter. "It's odd, sir, the way people move when they think they're unnoticed. At the show I saw several linger near Mrs. Wilcox's table, but not all with equal intent. Some merely admired the flowers, others, well, their eyes wandered too often to her things." Purbright nodded, drinking in the subtle cues. The distinction between casual curiosity and focused interest was often almost imperceptible, and yet it was precisely in these subtleties that truth resided. By afternoon, he visited the vicar, a man whose serene demeanour had always provided both comfort and occasional frustration to the town. The vicar welcomed Purbright into his study, which was neat to the point of obsession, with cushions perfectly aligned and books arranged by both subject and hue. Over tea, they spoke not of suspicion, but of routine. The parish, recent sermons, and the health of local parishioners. Yet, as the conversation unfolded, Purbright noted a slight but consistent habit. The vicar's gaze, however serene, frequently strayed toward the window overlooking the street, a subtle monitoring of the comings and goings of neighbours. This detail was trivial in itself, but in the context of human behaviour, every glance and every twitch of attention was significant. Later, back at his office, Purbright began to arrange these observations. He compared the behaviour of Mrs. Wilcox, the young women at the show, the tradesmen, and even the clergy, noting micro-patterns and small contradictions. The smudged envelope, the hesitation in recounting events, the flicker of diverted attention, they were insignificant in isolation, but together formed a faint but persistent thread of possibility. He considered the first suspect, Miss Aldridge, whose behaviour remained consistent, yet contained minor tensions that hinted at preoccupation or anxiety. He also reflected on the constable's eagerness to attribute guilt, aware that human behaviour could be superficially persuasive, yet entirely misleading. In Flaxborough, he knew, appearances were rarely straightforward, and social conformity often obscured more than it revealed. As dusk settled over the town, the inspector walked once more along the river, listening to the slow current and noting the occasional splash of a passing fish, the trivial anomaly of the smudged envelope, and the narrow gap between the dahlia displays occupied his thoughts. Each detail was minor, easily overlooked, yet together they began to form a lattice of opportunity and motive. Purbright returned to his office in the soft evening light, methodically reviewing each observation. He knew that small, seemingly trivial details often held the key to understanding human intention. The town's polite conjectures, the measured suspicion of neighbours, the subtle rivalries and fleeting gestures, they were the true evidence, far more revealing than any overt claim. Tomorrow, he reflected, would require a careful sequence of discreet observation, subtle questioning, and the patient monitoring of behaviour. The missing brooch had already revealed the town's latent tensions. Now it was a matter of tracing the smallest of signs, watching for those trivial deviations that would eventually illuminate the larger truth. In Flaxborough, nothing significant occurred loudly, and the quietest gestures often spoke the clearest. The following morning, Flaxborough seemed to pulse, with a gentle, almost imperceptible tension. The missing brooch had ceased to dominate conversation outright, yet its shadow lingered in polite murmurs at the market stalls, in cautious laughter at the hairdressers, and in the measured inquiries at the railway buffet. Inspector Purbright, strolling through the quiet streets with deliberate calm, noted that human behaviour in such circumstances was never straightforward. It was layered with concern, curiosity, and occasional envy, all of which moved in currents invisible to anyone not attuned to subtleties. His first stop was the town hall, where the flower show exhibits were being dismantled and returned to their usual places. The dismantling process created a perfect opportunity to observe movement and interaction, and Purbright wandered among the exhibitors with the patience of someone cataloguing the minutiae of the town's habits. Mrs. Trilby was already present, supervising the careful packing of her begonia prize with a kind of perfectionism that suggested both pride and latent rivalry. She cast the occasional glance toward Mrs. Wilcox's table, which had been hastily cleared of flowers and memorabilia, the velvet-lined box long gone. "Inspector," Mrs. Trilby said, her tone polite, yet carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "I suppose it is inevitable that some small disorder arises amidst such events. Yet one must wonder what sort of person could act so." "Indeed," Purbright replied softly, making no move to comment further. In Flaxborough, moral pronouncements were rarely literal. They were signals, gestures in a subtle social dance, and he observed them as carefully as one might watch the fluttering of a bird's wings. As he passed, his attention was caught by Mr. Langford, the retired banker, who lingered near the table once occupied by Mrs. Wilcox's brooch. Langford had the precise manner of a man who regarded public appearances as both a duty and an exercise in discreet control. He was inspecting the remains of the dahlia arrangement with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the triviality of the task. Purbright noted the micro-tension in Langford's shoulders, the slight narrowing of his eyes, and the subtle curling of a finger against his coat. The man's behavior was neither incriminating nor innocent. It was merely a thread to be followed, a small deviation from the otherwise disciplined pattern of social conduct. Further along, Purbright encountered Mrs. Cartwright, the grocer's wife, arranging the remaining produce with her habitual precision. She remarked casually on the missing brooch, inquiring if the inspector had heard any further news. In her expression and choice of words lay the faintest hint of schadenfreude, a slight tightening of her lips and a raised brow, which suggested that for all her civility she derived some satisfaction from the minor disruption in the town's harmony. Such subtlety was invisible to most, yet it contributed to Purbright's growing understanding of the town's social lattice. By mid-morning he had made his way to the vicarage, where the vicar himself was conducting the morning prayers with a serene efficiency. The conversation over tea was, on the surface, about parish matters and the upcoming summer festival, yet beneath the polite words were slight, almost imperceptible signals. A gentle tapping of the fingers when certain topics were mentioned, a careful monitoring of Purbright's gaze, and the occasional tilting of the head that suggested attention not only to conversation but to the flow of human behavior in general. The vicar's calm detachment was in itself an informative display. It marked him as a man attuned to appearances, possibly concealing his own subtle interest in the recent disturbances. Returning to the town streets, Purbright encountered the children who had been present at the flower show. They were now gathered around a small puddle near the bridge, engaged in whispered speculation that blended observation with imagination. Their comments were both humorous and telling. "I saw the lady in blue leaning closer," one whispered, and her hand twitched.
"Like she wanted something."
Another added, "The man with glasses was looking at the pearls, I'm sure of it." The innocence of youth, combined with their unfiltered attention, often revealed patterns overlooked by adults preoccupied with social conventions. Purbright filed these observations with care. By late morning, he visited Mrs. Wilcox again, ostensibly to discuss the unfolding events of the week. The widow was careful, almost ceremonious, in the preparation of tea, and spoke with a tone that balanced composure with genuine anxiety. "Inspector, it seems the town cannot help but speculate," she said, her voice steady though her hands twitched slightly as she poured. "I have received several polite inquiries and, if I am honest, a few rather pointed remarks. I hope you are not relying too heavily on public opinion." Purbright smiled faintly. "Public opinion is rarely a reliable guide, Mrs. Wilcox, though it is often informative as to social currents. What concerns me more are the small details, the minor gestures, and inconsistencies that reveal far more than loud declarations." As she described her interactions, Purbright noticed a subtle shift in her manner when she mentioned the gentleman in spectacles. There was a flicker of hesitation, a slight catch in her voice, as if a memory had been briefly obscured or a detail carefully edited. Such a trivial signal might be overlooked by anyone else, yet it spoke to Purbright's trained eye. In Flaxborough, a momentary lapse or embellishment could be a clue, however small. The afternoon was spent observing Hargreaves' buffet once again. The railway man moved with habitual efficiency, but Purbright noted the way his eyes scanned each patron, lingering on gestures and exchanges rather than the food itself. The subtle interactions of the town, conversations veiled in politeness, glances exchanged under the guise of civility, were now more apparent, a lattice of behavior intersecting in ways that suggested unspoken tensions and minor grievances. Evenings in Flaxborough carried a gentle rhythm. As Purbright walked home along the lamplit streets, he considered the growing complexity of the investigation. Each character, however ordinary in appearance, presented layers of subtle signals, hesitations, glances, posture, and small acts of avoidance or attention. The widow's anxiety, the young women's composure, the retired banker's attentiveness, the vicar's serene monitoring, and even the children's unsophisticated observations combined to form a network of behavioral threads that Purbright would follow with careful patience. Returning to his office, he reviewed the morning's notes. Patterns were emerging, faint but consistent, a subtle alignment of attention and distraction, gestures that contradicted spoken words, and a series of small anomalies that suggested more than a simple theft. The town's first obvious suspect, Miss Aldridge, remained under informal scrutiny, yet nothing had confirmed her guilt. Opportunity, intent, and human behavior were entangled, and only through careful, patient observation could the hidden motives be discerned. By the time he extinguished the desk lamp, the rain had ceased, leaving the streets slick and reflective. Flaxborough seemed to exhale, resuming its quiet appearance of order. Yet the web of subtle clues and trivial irregularities persisted, invisible to most, but vivid to Purbright's attention. Tomorrow, he reflected, he would follow these threads, further allowing the behavior of the town itself to reveal the deeper patterns that might explain the missing brooch. For in Flaxborough, as he had long known, truth was rarely announced loudly. It whispered in the smallest gestures, the slightest deviations, and the polite, cautious manner in which people moved through their daily lives. The week had settled into a rhythm that seemed at once ordinary and deceptive. Flaxborough's streets were calm, the markets well-tended, and the scent of damp earth and coal smoke rose from chimneys into the soft morning air. Yet beneath this serene surface, the quiet tension surrounding the missing brooch persisted. Conversations were now peppered with subtle references to events last week, polite inquiries that masked speculation, and glances that lingered just a moment too long. For Inspector Purbright, this was fertile ground. Human behavior rarely lay entirely beneath notice, and the faintest deviation from routine could illuminate a hidden truth. The day began with a small but telling incident at Hargreaves' railway buffet. A delivery of flowers intended for a local tea party was accidentally placed atop the counter beside the pastry display. As Hargreaves moved to correct the arrangement, a small envelope slid from beneath the petals and fluttered to the floor. It was addressed to Mrs. Wilcox, and Purbright recognized at once the neat handwriting of her niece. Yet the envelope had been torn, as though in haste, and a corner of the paper bore a faint crease that suggested hurried handling. Hargreaves, accustomed to the minutiae of daily operations, had scarcely noticed the anomaly. But to Purbright, it was a minor but significant deviation. The envelope was trivial in itself, containing only a brief note of affection, yet the hurried placement, the torn flap, and the crease indicated a distraction or a concealed concern. Such small signs often held the key in Flaxborough. They revealed the inner states of otherwise composed individuals. By mid-morning, Purbright had walked to Mrs. Wilcox's house, where the widow had received him with her characteristic dignity, though there was a faint tension in her expression that had not been present before. The envelope, now in her possession, elicited a quiet sigh. "It is only a note from my niece, Inspector," she said, carefully smoothing the paper with trembling fingers. "Yet I cannot help feeling that its arrival, and the manner of it, are somehow significant. Perhaps it is merely my imagination." "Perhaps," Purbright replied softly, noting the subtle shift in her voice. Yet in Flaxborough one often finds that what seems trivial is precisely the element that reveals intent. He remained for a time, observing the widow's movements, noting the slight hesitation when she recounted her interactions with neighbors, and the gentle inflection in her speech that suggested guarded emotion. Her gestures were composed, yet there was a faint tension in her hands, the subtle kind that betrayed concern over more than the missing brooch alone. Leaving the house, Purbright wandered along the high street, noting the usual throng of morning pedestrians, each absorbed in their own routines, yet unconsciously contributing to the town's social tapestry. In the bakery, a clerk adjusted a display while casting repeated glances toward the door, and at the grocer's, Mrs. Cartwright remarked on the disappearance of a small tin of imported biscuits, her words coated with polite detachment, yet tinged with the smallest trace of irony. It was in this environment of layered civility and observation that a second incident occurred, one that would complicate the emerging narrative. At the corner of Market Square, a small crowd had gathered around the notice board. A new announcement had been posted, a report of a missing cash box from the town's annual charity bazaar, held several weeks prior. The box itself contained a modest sum, but the discovery that it was absent and that no one had noticed until now shifted the atmosphere. People exchanged glances, whispered, and speculated on motives. Purbright arrived at the scene quietly, noting the subtle changes in demeanor among the witnesses. Mrs. Trilby, always concerned with propriety, was visibly flustered, whispering about the necessity of vigilance and the shocking audacity of such an act. Mr. Langford examined the notice with thinly veiled curiosity, his expression betraying a minor fascination with the breach of order. Even the children, who had gathered with innate enthusiasm, seemed to sense that the event carried significance beyond mere numbers or possessions. The incident altered the trajectory of inquiry in ways both subtle and profound. Miss Aldridge, previously the focal point of polite suspicion, was now less central in the collective imagination of the town. The missing cash box suggested that the earlier theft might not have been a personal matter, but part of a pattern, or at the very least, a coincidence that required reconsideration. Purbright noted the reactions carefully. The constables exchanged quiet observations, the townspeople adjusted their narratives to incorporate the new information, and the network of micro-behaviors shifted imperceptibly in response. Returning to the widow, Purbright considered the implications of the new discovery. The brooch, while missing, might not be connected to a singular intent. Rather, it could indicate a series of small, opportunistic actions, each intertwined with social expectations and the latent desires of otherwise ordinary citizens. Mrs. Wilcox, however, displayed only measured concern, her composure intact, though her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her tea. As the day progressed, Purbright moved through the town with careful attention. Each person he encountered, tradesmen, neighbors, clerks, and even the vicar, exhibited subtle responses to the second incident. There were faint shifts in posture, micro-expressions that betrayed curiosity, and slight hesitations in speech. Such details, though invisible to the casual observer, formed the lattice through which the inspector traced the undercurrents of intent and opportunity. By evening, he had returned to his office, where he methodically reviewed the day's observations. The second incident had expanded the field of inquiry considerably. It suggested either a broader opportunity for mischief or a coincidence that forced him to reconsider earlier assumptions. He compared the timing of each person's movement, the sequence of gestures, and the alignment of social attention. Patterns emerged, not definitive, but suggestive. Those who had been overly attentive at the flower show now exhibited restrained curiosity about the missing cash box, while others who had appeared indifferent showed faint signs of discomfort or distraction. In the quiet of his office, Purbright reflected on human behavior, noting that the ordinary actions of daily life, gestures, Glances, hesitations were often more revealing than overt accusations. The town's first obvious suspect remained under informal scrutiny, yet the second incident complicated matters. Opportunity, motive, and intention were no longer neatly aligned. The lattice of human behavior was growing in complexity, and only patient observation could hope to disentangle it. Night settled over Flaxborough, lamplight reflecting on wet streets, and the town resumed its outwardly serene rhythm. Yet beneath this calm, subtle shifts had occurred. Gossip adapted to incorporate new events, micro-behaviors realigned, and the pattern of attention and concern continued to reveal human nature in its quiet intricacies. Purbright, reviewing his notes one last time before retiring, knew that the path to truth required patience, careful observation, and a willingness to follow the faintest threads wherever they might lead. The missing brooch and the absent cash box were not merely objects, they were catalysts, exposing the hidden motivations and understated tensions of a town that prided itself on civility. The evening had settled with an unusual quiet in Flaxborough, a subdued hush that carried a faint weight of anticipation. Inspector Purbright sat alone at his desk, the lamplight casting a warm pool of illumination over neat stacks of notes, the handwriting of witnesses, and his own careful observations. The week's events, the flower show, the missing brooch, the second incident with the charity cash box, had left the town outwardly composed, yet beneath the polite facades he sensed a lattice of tensions, minor rivalries, and unspoken motives. Purbright poured himself a cup of tea, its steam rising in a thin spiral, and leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet stretch across the room. He considered human behavior not merely as a means to resolve the thefts, but as an intricate network of habits, desires, and social constraints. The townspeople, he knew, rarely acted with outright malice. Their actions were guided by curiosity, ambition, envy, and the desire to maintain appearances. And yet, within this ordinariness, subtle deviations, hesitations, micro-expressions, and the occasional ill-timed glance could illuminate intent with a clarity that no overt confession could match. He reviewed the day's observations, beginning with Mrs. Wilcox. Her composure, though outwardly impeccable, contained moments of slight hesitation when discussing the gentleman in spectacles, the movement of her jewellery box, and the arrival of her niece's letter. Each micro-pause, each careful inflection suggested the presence of worry that she neither fully acknowledged nor wished to display. Such details, small and ostensibly trivial, were vital. They were the threads by which Purbright would trace motive. Miss Aldridge remained an object of polite suspicion in the town's eyes, yet her behaviour continued to align with a carefully maintained composure. Still there were fleeting moments, tiny, adjustments in posture, a brief tightening of her hands, a subtle deviation in eye contact that hinted at internal conflict or distraction. These behaviours were almost imperceptible, and Purbright catalogued them with care, mindful that the difference between anxiety over a minor observation and the concealment of intent could be a matter of milliseconds and micro-expressions. He turned his attention next to Mr. Langford, whose fascination with the flower show tables and subsequent casual glances toward Mrs. Wilcox suggested a man attuned to social patterns. The banker's habitual monitoring of details, his calculated gestures, and the almost imperceptible rhythm of his attention implied both curiosity and the possibility of private motivation. Purbright noted that opportunity alone rarely generated guilt. The interplay of attention, motive, and access was the critical triad in human action. The widow's house provided another layer of intrigue. The smudged envelope, delivered in haste and bearing the faint crease of distraction, could be dismissed as a trivial anomaly, but Purbright had long observed that in Flaxborough, minor irregularities were often the footprints of intention. Whether it was a misplaced item, a hurried action, or a small lie, these signals spoke louder than any accusation shouted in public. As the evening deepened, Purbright considered the broader social environment. The town itself, with its neatly ordered streets, polished windows, and seemingly tranquil faces, was a living organism of civility and minor tensions. Tradesmen adjusted displays with precision, yet lingered on the movements of neighbours. Children whispered conjectures that, while naive, reflected observations adults sometimes missed. Clergy, exhibiting serene detachment, nonetheless registered subtle shifts in the town's emotional topography. Every individual in their ordinary routines contributed to a network of behavior that could reveal hidden motives if one watched closely enough. Purbright sipped his tea and contemplated the constable's eagerness to assign blame. Their inclination toward a tidy solution, Miss Aldridge, was understandable but premature. In human behavior, he reflected, certainty often emerged not from confrontation, but from the patient observation of subtle deviations. He considered the lattice of the past week: gestures, pauses, minor hesitations, and incongruities. Each was a small prism through which the broader truth could refract, revealing angles invisible to those focused solely on overt facts. In the privacy of his office, Purbright also considered the role of envy, ambition, and propriety. Mrs. Trilby's attentiveness to social order, the quiet fascination of Mr. Langford, the measured observations of Hargreaves, and even the children's innocent conjectures were all interconnected. They revealed the delicate balance of respectability and curiosity, the unspoken rules governing conduct, and the minor deviations that, when pieced together, disclosed intent. A subtle plan began to form. Purbright realized that the truth might not be drawn from direct confrontation, but from the gentle orchestration of circumstances, an observation designed to provoke a reaction, a remark calculated to unsettle, a situation contrived with civility, yet loaded with potential insight. The test would be understated, indirect, and invisible to those who were not attuned to behavioral nuance. He considered the sequence carefully. First, the placement of objects and opportunities. Second, the timing of movements and glances. Third, the orchestration of social circumstances that would reveal the guilty party through instinctive reaction rather than voluntary admission. The lattice of behavior would guide him, and patience would be his instrument. Night deepened, the lamplight softening shadows in his office. The town outside seemed quiet, yet the air carried the invisible currents of attention, concern, and speculation. Every neighbor, every passerby, every observer of polite ritual contributed unknowingly to the experiment that Purbright was about to conduct. In Flaxborough, the ordinary and the extraordinary were intertwined, and the simplest gesture could reveal the hidden motives that lay beneath civility. Finally, he put down his teacup, methodically reviewing his notes one last time before retiring. He knew that in the coming days, subtle observation, careful timing, and the orchestration of minor social tests would reveal the truth. In Flaxborough, as he had long known, human nature spoke quietly but insistently, and the patient observer could decipher it with precision. The missing brooch, the second incident, and the lattice of human behavior were now aligned. All that remained was to wait and watch, allowing instinctive actions and inadvertent gestures to illuminate the hidden narrative. The morning unfolded with the soft, meticulous calm characteristic of Flaxborough in late spring, when the hedgerows glistened with dew, and the air carried both the faint scent of freshly baked bread and the faint tang of coal smoke from chimneys. Inspector Purbright set out from his office with quiet determination, his mind preoccupied with the careful orchestration he had been planning. The previous week had provided a lattice of observations, small hesitations, minor inconsistencies and trivial anomalies, but he knew that only through a subtle test could the threads of human behavior be teased into revealing the underlying truth. His first stop was Mrs. Wilcox's house, where he arrived promptly as the widow attended to her morning routines. The widow greeted him with her usual composure, though there was a flicker of curiosity, slightly restrained, yet unmistakable, at his unexpected arrival. Purbright offered polite remarks regarding the town's progress in recovering from the flower show and expressed his interest in the orderly resumption of daily routines. The widow, careful not to betray too much, described her engagements for the day, a short visit to the post office, the preparation of afternoon tea, and a minor errand to the grocer's. "It is the small routines, Inspector," she said, smoothing the folds of her apron, "that give life its balance. One cannot allow disorder, even in trifles, to take hold." "Indeed, Mrs. Wilcox," Purbright said gently, his voice calm and deliberate. "And yet sometimes it is the trifles themselves that speak the loudest, if only one pays attention." She inclined her head, eyes narrowing slightly, a micro-expression that he noted with care. There was nothing overtly revealing, yet the subtle tightening of her lips and the brief catch in her breath suggested awareness of more than he let on. It was precisely the type of reaction he hoped to provoke, a minor, involuntary indication of interest or concern. Purbright's next engagement was ostensibly a routine visit to the railway buffet. Hargreaves received him with habitual efficiency, though the constable's usual discreet commentary was replaced by an almost imperceptible alertness, a heightened attentiveness to the patrons and to Purbright himself. The inspector casually mentioned the recent charity bazaar and the continuing speculation regarding the missing brooch. The casual remark was carefully constructed, neither accusatory nor leading, but sufficiently suggestive to provoke subconscious reactions. He observed closely as Miss Aldridge entered the buffet, ostensibly to purchase a small loaf of bread. Her movements were graceful, composed, yet Purbright's attention registered the fraction of a second during which her eyes flicked toward the counter where he had seated himself. The movement was almost imperceptible, a subtle deviation from normal behavior, but it indicated alertness, a brief, involuntary reaction to his presence and the conversation he had initiated. He made no overt acknowledgement, allowing her micro-expression to remain unchallenged, a silent revelation of interest. Throughout the morning, Purbright continued his carefully measured interactions. He visited the vicar, noting the serene composure, the subtle attentiveness, and the occasional glance toward windows that overlooked the streets of Flaxborough. Each of these observations added layers to the emerging portrait, gestures that were polite and conventional on the surface, but contained minor fluctuations betraying private attention. The lattice of human behavior, meticulously documented, began to form patterns that suggested hidden priorities, discrete concerns, and unspoken anxieties. In the early afternoon, he returned to the town centre, positioning himself at a vantage point from which he could observe multiple routines simultaneously: tradesmen closing shop, children playing near the fountain, and neighbours conversing in measured tones on the pavements. Purbright allowed himself only occasional notes, relying primarily on attentive observation. He was attuned not only to what was said, but to what remained unspoken, the alignment of glances, the shifting of posture, the timing of gestures. All these formed a subtle, living map of social dynamics. It was at precisely the moment when a group of townswomen approached Mrs. Wilcox on her return from the grocer's that Purbright noticed the decisive clue, a fleeting adjustment of her coat, a quick glance toward the post office, and the slightest tightening of her fingers on the basket. The movement was imperceptible to anyone not focused, yet for Purbright it confirmed the presence of concealed intent. The widow's gestures, though outwardly composed, betrayed an inner vigilance, a monitoring of potential exposure, and a minute reaction to the environment that suggested knowledge beyond casual awareness. He allowed the moment to pass, neither confirming nor drawing attention to it. In Flaxborough, as he had long observed, the guilty often revealed themselves not through confession, but through involuntary micro-behaviors, carefully recorded and patiently interpreted. Throughout the day, he orchestrated small interactions, casual remarks about the flower show, inquiries regarding the charity bazaar, and indirect references to the flow of visitors to maintain an environment in which these subtle indicators could manifest naturally. By late afternoon, he had compiled a detailed record of behavioral responses, slight hesitations in speech, fractional movements of attention, fleeting expressions of concern or distraction, and minor gestures revealing preoccupation. The lattice of observation pointed consistently toward one individual whose reactions were minute but unmistakable when viewed in the context of the town's broader social patterns. Opportunity, access, and motive were now revealed not through forensic evidence, but through the persistent, patient observation of ordinary human behavior. As evening approached, the town resumed its calm exterior, unaware of the silent interrogation that had unfolded in their midst. Purbright, satisfied that the subtle test had produced the necessary indications, retired to his office. He reviewed the day's carefully recorded observations, noting the convergence of micro-behaviors and incongruities. The evidence, imperceptible to the casual observer yet resolutely consistent, formed a portrait of intent and awareness that he could now begin to interpret with clarity. The week's events, from the missing brooch to the absent cash box, had provided the stage. His patient orchestration and subtle provocations had illuminated the actor. All that remained was to arrange a setting in which the final revelations could be shared without ceremony, in a manner both polite and civil, and to allow the lattice of behavior, meticulously observed and interpreted, to speak for itself. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Wilcox's drawing room, casting a dappled light across the polished mahogany table. Inspector Purbright arrived punctually, his gait measured and calm, carrying neither accusation nor expectation, only the quiet authority of observation. The widow greeted him with her usual poise, though there was an almost imperceptible tension in her hands as she placed a silver tray of tea before him. The subtle arrangements of the room, the careful alignment of chairs, the delicate porcelain, cups, and the faint scent of lavender reflected a life devoted to civility, order, and the maintenance of appearances. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "I trust your day has been satisfactory." "Indeed, Mrs. Wilcox," Purbright replied, his voice calm and even, "and I hope you have found the morning tolerable, despite the small disturbances of the week." She gave a polite smile and poured tea, the clink of china punctuating the soft rhythm of conversation. Purbright allowed a few moments to pass, sipping gently, letting the silence serve as a prelude to the observations he intended to share. In Flaxborough, truth rarely emerged through abrupt revelation. It preferred instead the patience of subtle induction, the quiet alignment of fact and behavior. "Mrs. Wilcox," he began carefully, "we have spent some time considering not only the occurrences at the flower show, but also the subsequent incident with the charity cash box. Both events, while apparently discrete, have provided a framework within which one may understand the ordinary movements of the town's residents and their otherwise imperceptible responses." The widow inclined, her head, her fingers pausing momentarily on her cup. "I confess, Inspector, I do not fully understand where this is leading. I have endeavored to be as forthright as possible in recounting my own actions and observations." "Quite so," Purbright said, offering a small, civil smile. "And your diligence has been exemplary, yet in matters of human behavior it is. Often the smallest gestures, the briefest hesitation, the involuntary glance that reveal far more than words alone." He paused, allowing the weight of his observation to settle in the room. "During my visits, I noted a series of minor anomalies: the smudged envelope, the brief tightening of hands, the glances directed with undue caution or attentiveness, and the slight adjustments of posture in response to casual remarks. Each was trivial in isolation, yet together they formed a consistent pattern that illuminated awareness, concern, and, ultimately, involvement." Mrs. Wilcox's expression remained composed, yet Purbright observed the subtle flicker of recognition, a fractional shift in her gaze, and the faint catch in her breath. All the involuntary indicators he had catalogued over the past week. She did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to provide a mirror in which her own actions and attention might be reflected. "Inspector," she said finally, her tone carefully measured, "you are suggesting that one of the town's residents, possibly myself, has had knowledge or involvement beyond what is apparent?" Purbright's smile was gentle, devoid of accusation. "Not accusation, Mrs. Wilcox, merely observation. In Flaxborough, civility is maintained with great care, yet it is rarely absolute. Minor deviations from routine, when observed over time, can indicate a broader pattern. The missing brooch and the absent cash box, while outwardly simple occurrences, revealed a lattice of attention and intention that could not have arisen by chance alone." He leaned slightly forward, his gaze calm and unyielding, and continued, "The truth, in this instance, is that the sequence of events was motivated not by malice, but by a combination of opportunity, distraction, and perhaps a desire to manage the appearance of propriety. The subtle gestures, the inconsistencies in minor details, the fleeting reactions, all point to the same individual who, under ordinary circumstances, would never consciously admit to the acts." Mrs. Wilcox's hands trembled slightly, the faintest hint of anxiety threading through her otherwise composed posture. "You mean that it was I?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Precisely," Purbright said softly, his tone gentle and civil. "The evidence is not found in loud accusations or dramatic confrontations, but in the small, persistent details, the smudged envelope, the moments of hesitation, the attention paid where one might ordinarily be indifferent. Your awareness of events and your minor interventions created a pattern that, when carefully observed, revealed the truth. The lattice of human behavior spoke, and the careful observer could read it." She lowered her gaze to the teacup, a faint blush colouring her cheeks, yet she maintained her composure in voice and gesture. "I see. I suppose one might call it a lapse of attention and timing, rather than deliberate wrongdoing." "Indeed," Purbright replied, sipping his tea with measured calm. "Circumstance and human frailty often combine in ways that are more subtle than the public suspects. No dramatics are required. The ordinary rhythms of civility themselves can produce deviations that, when carefully noted, reveal reality." For a moment silence filled the room, punctuated only by the gentle ticking of a clock. Purbright allowed the widow to absorb the revelation, maintaining a tone of civility and observation that emphasized reflection rather than rebuke. In Flaxborough, the resolution of a minor scandal was as much a matter of restoring social equilibrium as of uncovering truth. "I shall, of course, ensure that the brooch is returned to its proper place," Mrs. Wilcox said, finally raising, her eyes to meet his. "And the town will no doubt remain none the wiser for the details you have so quietly discerned." "Precisely," Purbright said, inclining his head. "The town's harmony need not be disrupted. Politeness and civility endure, yet the lattice of observation remains, a quiet record of human behavior and the minor deviations that illuminate it." As he took his leave, the sun had begun to dip behind the rooftops, casting a warm glow across the streets. Flaxborough appeared as it had always done, orderly, polite, and tranquil. Yet beneath the surface, the lattice of actions, gestures, and minor behaviors had been resolved. The town's rhythms continued, subtly shifted by the gentle restoration of propriety and understanding. The morning that followed the revelation dawned with the usual gentle precision of Flaxborough, the streets glistening from an overnight drizzle, and the air carrying a soft mix of earthiness and the faint tang of coal smoke. Inspector Purbright moved quietly through the town, observing as always, though with a sense of completion mingled with his habitual patience. The previous day's revelation at Mrs. Wilcox's drawing-room had quietly restored order, yet subtle changes in the social lattice of the town were already manifesting in small, almost imperceptible ways. At the railway buffet, Hargreaves arranged the tea trays with his usual fastidious attention. He noted with a discreet nod the arrival of regular patrons, none of whom seemed aware of the week's minor disruptions or the careful resolution thereof. Miss Aldridge entered with a composed grace, greeting him politely. Her slight blush and the careful adjustment of her gloves suggesting a lingering awareness of her previously scrutinized behavior. Yet she carried herself with the calm civility expected in Flaxborough, the town's outward harmony restored. Mrs. Trilby was already present at the market square, arranging her flower cart with habitual diligence. She glanced toward Mrs. Wilcox's house with the faintest flicker of curiosity, then returned to her dahlias, a subtle acknowledgment of events past and an unspoken understanding that social propriety must continue. Even Mr. Langford, the retired banker, exhibited an attentiveness that was now tempered by civility, his previously curious glances replaced with small gestures of polite observation, as though the lattice of events had been consciously acknowledged and set aside. Purbright allowed himself a quiet smile as he wandered further along the high street. The children who had whispered conjectures earlier in the week were now engaged in games, their innocent observations having served as inadvertent instruments in the uncovering of truth. Adults moved through the streets with gentle adjustments. To posture, expressions softened, and the subtle, shared acknowledgment of restored propriety manifested in polite nods and careful smiles. Returning to Mrs. Wilcox, Purbright observed the widow in her garden, tending the roses with a meticulous hand. She glanced up briefly, noting his presence with quiet acknowledgment, and then returned to her pruning, the faint tension of the week now eased. The brooch had been restored to its proper place, discreetly handled, and the small anomalies that had disrupted the town's rhythm had been resolved without public spectacle. Purbright, walking along the gravel path, reflected on the nature of civility in Flaxborough. Truth, when approached with patience and observation, could be reconciled with propriety, and the lattice of human behavior could be read with subtlety. Rather than confrontation, he paused near the hedge, watching as a postman delivered letters to neighboring homes. Each resident, engaged in ordinary routines, exhibited micro-adjustments, slight shifts in posture, tiny realignments of glances, and the careful pacing of conversation. These were the echoes of the week's events, subtle reminders that humans' behavior, though often disciplined by social norms, was never entirely predictable. Opportunity, attention, and reaction continued to interplay in ways that revealed character, even as the town outwardly maintained its ordinary rhythm. By mid-morning, Purbright returned to his office, where he reviewed the detailed notes and behavioral records he had compiled over the past week. The patterns were consistent. Minor deviations in posture, gestures, and attention had pointed to Mrs. Wilcox's unintentional involvement, and his subtle test had confirmed the truth through observation rather than direct accusation. He sipped his tea, reflecting on the manner in which human frailty and civility intertwined, how the lattice of ordinary life had both concealed and revealed the truth. The town moved on in its quiet, measured way. The flower show and charity bazaar had become part of local history, discussed in whispers of polite amusement or curiosity at the market stalls, yet without rancour or scandal. Mrs. Wilcox resumed her routines with calm dignity, the minor perturbations, leaving only a faint imprint in her careful gestures. Miss Aldridge, Mr. Langford, and Mrs. Trilby adjusted to the resumed equilibrium, their behaviours subtly altered but outwardly consistent with the town's expectations of civility and decorum. In the late afternoon, Purbright walked the perimeter of Market Square, observing the interplay of social interactions. The lattice of human behaviour had been tested, the truth revealed, and yet the town maintained its seamless outward harmony. Each smile, glance, and polite word was now informed by the quiet acknowledgement of the week's events, subtle adjustments that reflected understanding without disruption. As evening descended, the streets glowed with lamplight, casting a gentle warmth on the cobblestones. Purbright returned to his office for the final time that day, closing the door behind him and setting his notes carefully in order. The week's observations, patient tests, and subtle revelations had resolved the incidents with civility intact, demonstrating once again that in Flaxborough truth was rarely loud, drama was unnecessary, and human behaviour, when carefully observed, spoke with clarity and precision. He sat back in his chair, taking one last sip of tea, the quiet satisfaction of a job concluded settling over him. The town outside resumed its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the intricate lattice of attention and behaviour that had been revealed, tested, and reconciled. For Inspector Purbright, this was the ideal resolution, civility restored, lessons quietly imparted, and human nature acknowledged in its subtle complexity. The town was once more at peace, orderly in appearance, nuanced in reality, and perfectly ordinary in its small-town rhythms. Yet beneath that ordinariness lay the intricate patterns that had revealed the truth to the patient observer.